Hey, hello. Welcome to the Can You Detect This inside the Ransomware Operators Toolkit. So my name is Pete. I'm part of the DFIR Report team of analysts. So we make up a team of about 8 or 9. We're global based and we all do this in our own time. So we're volunteer analysts and we've all got skills in doing intrusion analysis, and some of us are special skills in malware reverse engineering, memory forensic analysis and so on. But at the foundation level, we all have a core set of skills being able to work with threat intelligence, do triage investigations, work with the data and exploit that. So I've been contributing to the DFIR Report Cases, so providing the analyst insight for quite a while now. Most of our cases are ransomware intrusions, and we report on methods of detection. I specialise in threat hunting, incident response, and detection engineering. So this presentation, the focus is on the review of the common tools and techniques of 2021. So we published a report on our website early on this year, where from the analysis of a lot of the cases, we reported the common techniques that the ransomware threat groups use, and the types of tools and procedures that they follow. So we've collated that into like a trend analysis charts. So in the presentation, we'll also be covering the attack objectives and how this fits in with the attack lifecycle. And then we'll be mapping typical attack and how to leverage the detection. So where do we need to detect in order to prevent the ransomware threat operator from progressing? And then we're going to focus more on the human side, because ultimately they are human operated ransomware threat groups. There is a human being behind this. It's not automatic. It's not just code that fires and then you just get ransomware. There is a human operator, what is using tools, deciding when not to use tools, and then making decisions where they go through the intrusion. And then finally, some useful resources for defenders. There's a lot of material out there. So what can we do to prevent, detect and respond to ransomware intrusions? So just a bit of a background on the DFIR report. So our aim is to provide cyber threat intelligence that is actionable and tells the story of an intrusion using MITRE tactics, techniques and procedures. So like I said before, we deal with a lot of different types of intrusion cases. So from nation-state-sponsored APTs through to organised crime groups. But a bulk of our cases is predominantly ransomware threat actors. So as a reader, looking at this information in the report, you should be able to understand what the attacker did and how they accomplished their goals, and importantly, how to defend IT systems. So it's not all about just providing IOCs as the malware hashes, here's the IP address that they use. It's all about the techniques that they leverage. So forgetting the IPs and the hashes, for those familiar with the pyramid of pain, the easy stuff to report on is the atomic indicators, such as IP addresses. What's really tough is the top level, which is the tradecraft that the threat actor uses. So that's what we're aiming for. So all our reports are free. They're available on the website. We've been referenced by the US CERT and various other organisations as well. So the aim is to provide concise and detailed indicators and indicators of activities and so on that's doing. So before I do a deep dive into the content, just a recap on OPSEC. So So we just have to be a bit careful. So we provide cyber threat intelligence. So the moment it's out in the community, both good and bad guys can utilise that. So we do know that our threat intelligence has been used by attackers. They have been used by ransomware threat groups. So, for example, in the Conti leaks, so Conti is a ransomware threat group. They were breached end of last year, early this year, where an insider effectively leaked all their tradecraft, all their internal chat discussions and so on. And there were references to our reports in there. They were using our reports to track rival ransomware threat groups. And yeah, so that was quite interesting. But it just goes to show we knew that would happen. So anything else pushed out there. So we have to strike a balance between providing actual intelligence to the community, but at the same time, not to disclose our source, i.e. where the intrusion happened, and the methods, and which are methods in terms of like detection, instant response, and so on, because they could evade that, and that could potentially jeopardise future cases. So for all of this, we follow the traffic light protocol to protect our data. So any identifiable data relating to the case itself, which is like the environment, such as the IP addresses, host names, specific user accounts, that kind of detail, we obscure that in the reports. So you'll see in screenshots where they are redacted, blacked out, effectively. That has no impact in terms of the threat intelligence because, like I said before, it's all about the activities, the tools that they use to move around the network to achieve their goals. So knowing the compromised environment is irrelevant to the threat intelligence. So the brief, this presentation brief is TLP wide, so it can be released. There's nothing sensitive in there. So anything what's TLP read, we treat internally within our team. So in order to provide reports, we have to work with data. So these are the 4 principal types of data that we work with. So all these are artifacts that we collect from the endpoints on the network. We don't do any hackback or probe any attacker infrastructure or anything like that. So the 4 artifacts are memory, files, network, and logs. So these are the core ingredients, so to speak. Our main source is logs, because they are smaller in size. They typically track the whole intrusion from beginning to end. And the log sources can vary from everything from AV logs to actual host logs themselves, such as like authentication logs. And it could include web logs or even EDR logs, so on. So it's quite a wide range. Collecting, processing and storing that is cheap. So that's our principal data source that we work with. And the other useful data source that we have is network-based. So we're looking at data on the wire. So packet capture is fundamentally the raw data type. These are larger in file size, but we can use this because if you capture the packet capture, you can pull out a lot of useful information such as the C2 activity, user agent strings, obviously the domain supports, and even data, binary data that is going across the wire, so like downloaded files and even like certificates and everything. So there's quite a lot of data that we could never get in the logs. The challenge we have with the network is just making sure having the right collector deployed on the right part of the network. The other one is files. So we usually focus our file collection on drop files. So we're not going to pull all the files relating to the Windows directory. So we're looking for anything what's been tampered, anything that's in the user folders, things like that. And again, that can vary depending on the host and so on. So it's quite important to have collection script for doing that bulk collection. Lastly is memory. So this is the largest file size. So that is driven by the host. So if you've got a host that has a large RAM memory footprint, doing a memory dump on that could be quite expensive. There are challenges around that. So the memory itself can be like a snapshot in time. So you really do need to capture when you know that there's malware on there. But if you get the right memory capture, you can really exploit it by pulling out the malware, understanding or confirming hypotheses and correlating that back to the log sources. So it is quite rich, but that is very detailed, really at depth. It's only on one host, so don't forget you've got multiple hosts on the network. So you need to really think about, how do I do this at scale? And do I really want to do a memory dump for every single host, or just focus on particular ones of interest? So they're the kind of data that we work with. So we structure the report in a way that provides a timeline of the intrusion. So that's the best way where it articulates the beginning to end, what the attacker did on one day to the next day, if there are any gaps. Then we document each stage of the intrusion by the technique. So we try to use a MITRE attack because it's a very good way of it's a common language. Everyone is broadly familiar with MITRE attack techniques. So we try to correlate against that. And then we also provide screenshots as well, where we can in the reports. And in the case of ransomware attacks, there's a lot of emphasis in other cyber threat intelligence providing IOC on the encryptor bit, which is right at the end. So we don't just focus on that, we focus on the whole chain. So what tools do they use prior to deploying the encryptor? And we also cover about how they establish this foothold, how did they get onto the network, and so on. And so we try to focus on indicator activities, but we do provide the IOCs as well. But we do try and make a strong point on activities. So in most of our cases, the initial access starts with a phishing email. In most, not all, but in most. So here's some example screenshots that we've got from some cases. And yeah, and then ultimately it ends in a ransomware note that is dropped on a desktop or presented on the screen. But it doesn't happen by magic. It's not like an email comes in with an attachment, someone clicks on it and boom, the whole network's encrypted. There is a chain of events, and it can get quite complicated depending on the scale of the network. So there's activities about, okay, once the user clicks on somewhere, how do they maintain the foothold? And then from there, how do they discover other assets of interest? And then how do they move around the network? Where do they find those critical files? And then at what point do they exfiltrate? And then how do they encrypt it, and so on. So the initial access to ransom, the shortest we've seen it is about 2 hours. More complex cases, it's been weeks. So again, it does vary. And I think part of it does depend on the size of the network and how easy it is to get to those critical files to encrypt them. So let's start off with the initial access. So this is the email. So a lot of the malware variants that come through tend to be like ICE-ID, Bazaar, TrickBot. So they come through mail spam campaigns. So that is fairly sophisticated malware. They've been operating for a number of years. The malware variants are actually developed. It's designed to evade security tooling. They've been successful, and they're continuing to do that. They do go through phases where there'll be takedowns of networks, and then a rebuild, and then launch again. So the malware variants typically tend to be an email with embedded documents or macro-based documents, that kind of thing. In the last few months, we've seen threat actors using ISO images. So effectively, these are like containers, and in there, they'll have an initial payload embedded in there. And that's designed to avoid the mark up the web. So that is designed to bypass content filtering and endpoint security tooling. So in one case, the ISO image contained a legitimate looking shortcut file link, and in there is a malicious DLL. So when the user clicks the link file, the DLL gets executed, for example, by run DLL32, and then the bizarre loader infection chain is initiated. So quite simple. It can be quite complex. It does require on the user clicking, following instructions in email, but a well-crafted email targeted an unsuspecting user who's either expecting a similar email or just not educated. It does happen, and they've been very effective at that. So after gaining the initial foothold, we've seen TrickBot serving as access brokers for various ransomware groups. So the biggest one is Conti. So last September, like I say, it wasn't just emails. We saw an intrusion that came via proxy shell on Microsoft Exchange. So this is the only case that we've really seen where a vulnerability was exploited. So at the time, proxy shell was quite easy to access, quite high severity, public facing, so it just had the right ingredients to exploit. And there was proof of code, concept code release, so it was quite easy for the threat group to pick that up, weaponize it, and incorporate it as part of their techniques. So, but accessing vulnerabilities is quite hard. So they tried to go for vulnerabilities that are quite that could impact a number of different types of organisations. So Exchange is a popular vector. So from a detection point of view, from documents, we can look for Office applications that are spawning unusual child processes, such as living off the LAN binaries, such as Red Server 32, Run DLL, and even direct calls to command.exe. So the business email compromise is still a goal for the attacker. It's still active. It's still happening now. So it's designed to bypass the endpoint security tooling. It's a cat and mouse game. They'll constantly evolve. You've seen recent vulnerabilities in the last month or so. So the new features being exploited in Microsoft Office. It's just never ending. So in this example, we can see quite a complex process execution tree where a document has multiple different payloads and ways of execution. So it's multi-stage. So it's spinning a process and then reaching out, downloading a file, spinning up another process, calling an HTML application, and then that triggers something else. So very complex. And in this one, the DLL was masqueraded as a JPEG. So despite attempts to evade a lot of the security tooling and so on, looking at that, you can say that's not normal. So if you've got that telemetry being collected, you should be able to see that, and it is unusual. So looking for unexpected process interactions, files being dropped into non-standard locations such as temp folders, especially DLLs and so on. They're really obvious signs of indicators. So the next step is, okay, they've got access, is maintaining a foothold on that endpoint. So it's still fairly fragile. The process could crash, terminate, and they've lost access again. It would require the user clicking on it again. So the threat actors will employ several techniques to maintain that foothold. So common ones are what we saw in 50% of our cases is creation of scheduled tasks. So this is effectively like a backdoor. So another popular technique that attackers perform is the creation of new users on the endpoint, and then adding users to local admins or remote desktops users as well. So it doesn't depend on that user account. So if the user logs out, they've got a ways and means of getting back into it. In another case, we saw a bitch job being created, and that was calling a malicious DLL every 3 hours for the length of the intrusion. So various different ways of maintaining persistence. They also, what we have seen do is deploy the likes of TeamViewer, AnyDesk, Splashtop, Arturo Agent. So these are legitimate remote access tools. And so if an organisation is using that, that could appear legitimate. And again, there's always a risk that if they've used their initial access to get in, and it is malware, it could get detected at some point by an AV, and they're just burn access. So having a legitimate means to stay on there, again, that's another technique. So if you understand your baseline, so if you know you don't use those tools, and then you start seeing the network traffic to Splashtop servers, again, that's definitely worth investigating. If you start seeing tools being dropped and installed on those endpoints with remote access capabilities, that should be a red flag, and certainly something which should be looked at. And then the obvious ones are run key registries, so very easy to do. So if add a new run key, so if a user just log out, log back in, it will just start up again. And in the likes of proxy shell vulnerability, that was slightly different. They ended up dropping a lot of web shells to maintain access on there. Again, they were very conscious that they were using a publicly available exploit that could be detected and removed. But if they change the configuration, add in a backdoor web shell, that's a good way to hide their access. The next stage, okay, they got initial access, they've established a foothold, so they're in a good position. They know they've got remote access to that machine now, so, but they're still nowhere near to ransomware in the environment. So in order to deliver their threats, they need to understand that environment. So ideally, what they're aiming for is to escalate their privileges, because the chances are the user account they compromise is probably just a general enterprise user, probably didn't have much access, apart from accessing a few file shares and other resources. So they really need to get higher level privileges. So in virtually all the cases that we come across, they've always deployed a Cobalt Strike beacon. That is very common as part of their tradecraft. They use the built-in function, the technical name pipe impersonation, also known as get system. And so they use that as a service to effectively get system level privileges. There's a great article on Red Canary titled Hunting for Get System in Offensive Security Tools. So they go through a lot of detail about how that function works and methods of detection. One of our fellow analysts, he's created a series of blogs, Cobalt Strike Defender's Guide, and it's available on the website as well. So there's a lot of detection indicators to work through from there. And we've also seen PowerShell, which bypasses UAC. So again, a means to getting into high integrity. So once they've got that system level, they really want to be moving around the network, and they can start targeting the LSAS process. So that is a privileged process. That does a lot of the interactions and authentication to a lot of the host resources and other resources on the network. And in a majority of the cases, the primary mechanism for interacting with that is via Cobalt Strike beacons. So other methods, quite simple but effective, is dumping of the LSAS process. So they effectively take a memory dump, and then they'll use things like sysinternals proc dump, again, legitimate tool developed by Microsoft. It's primarily used for debugging applications and so on, that's dumping process memory. Even using Task Manager, if you've got that level of privilege. Another fairly infamous one is Mimikat. So that should be fairly rare, and that should trigger a lot of antivirus alerts. So if you do see that running on the endpoints, a Mimikat tool, then I would pay attention to that. It's primarily used by pen testers, red teamers. It could be used internally for testing security tools and controls, but if you do see it, and if you're not seeing it, then I'll be really concerned about the AV. So not so common is dumping the registry hives, especially the SAM security and system registry hives. So while performing all of these, because they are doing fairly dangerous activities now, accessing credential resources, and a lot of the tooling should detect that. But what they would do prior to that, so they will take certain measures to avoid getting caught. And one of those is discovering the installed antivirus and disabling those. So some of the common techniques are making registry keys in a GPO and disabling Defender, for example. So we see that quite a lot. And there are some other tools out there, such as Defender Control, where you can disable like cloud submission and all that kind of thing. So again, look for that. If you've got visibility of the AVs and all of a sudden you've got endpoints that aren't updating or communicating to you, then it's definitely worth investigating. The other technique is process injection. So where they spawn the process, but what they need to do really is hide that beacon and they'll migrate it into another process, which is legitimate. So again, it's all about evasion. So just expanding a bit more on discovery, they spend a lot of time doing discovery. So they perform a number of discovery commands, and they'll do that frequently. So they won't just do it once on the endpoint, they'll be doing it across multiple endpoints. And the discoveries can vary from doing, looking at security tools, determining what users logged in, what files are installed, and trying to find credentials and so on. So it's continuous. Some of the common tools we see, living off the land, built-in Windows features, is net.exe and LTS for network discovery. They want to see if that endpoint is connected to any other endpoints. So you see them running really quick succession. It's pretty unusual. You may see admin scripts doing that as part of a configuration testing, but as a normal environment, if you start seeing dozens and dozens of probing activity, that should be a red flag. And the other one, the graph, there's a lot of different Windows commands that they use across all the intrusions, but they also bring in a lot of other tools onto the environment as well. And so two of the common tools that we see repeatedly across our cases, one is AD-Find and another one is Bloodhound. So both of those are used for Active Directory enumeration. Again, quite noisy. Bloodhound, as a binary, the collector bit, it should get detected by AVs and so on. Tools like AD-Find may not get detected by AVs because it is a legitimate system admin tool. Other types of tools they use for probing are port scanning tools. A common one is Advanced IP Scanner. We see that quite a lot, just being dropped and effectively almost like nmapped across the network. And other ones like port scan. In the proxy shell and the exchange, we saw commandlets being exploited, such as get inbox rule, get mailbox, those kind of things. Again, very unusual. It's not something you see all the time. And so once they get onto the endpoint, they really need to start pivoting to get to domain controllers, file shares, things like that. So, and backup servers as well. So for lateral movement, they spend a lot of time deploying other beacons across the network. And they'll use that. The primary comms is SMB. So they spend a lot of time building their infrastructure internally And they'll data chain them all together. And they'll also deploy remote access on certain endpoints as well, such as like AnyDesk and so on. So not everything is just going to be done through that initial access point. They'll try to spread the load a little bit. Other popular tool for lateral movement is System Internal PSEC. Again, system admin tool. It's very commonly used in an environment. System administrators use it for troubleshooting. So just look for unusual use of that. And if it's coming from endpoints that you don't normally see it being executed from, that's worth having a look at. Other types of remote execution is using WMI, where they interact directly with the host and execute commands. So once they've done the initial access, established foothold, done the lateral movement, they've done the discovery, they'll start doing exfiltration, and they may do some exfiltration throughout the intrusion. So some of the things they do, there's established station servers where they'll dump their data, and the data might be in a user's folder, which is quite hidden away. And then, just like what we do when we're sending emails, they'll compress their data to make it smaller, so there are multiple files and artifacts to work with. And then they will upload them. In terms of data artifacts, they've also tried to dump SQL databases. So it's not all about just files or process dumps and things like that. It can be anything else on there, such as configuration, database servers. And in terms of exfiltration, there was a trend at one point or using the mega storage service, and they were using rclone quite a lot. It's effectively a file transfer utility, and they would just upload all the data. Pretty easy to spot in the in network logs. The other types of utilities include WinSCP, FileZilla, again, common utilities that you'd expect to see on a network. In one of the intrusions, a really interesting one, when they dumped the OSAS process, they actually just opened the web browser and just uploaded it to ufile.io. So really simple. It worked. So we can monitor network connections. We can kind of see what they're doing, where data's going, and so on, what processes are firing on. IPs and so on. So yeah, if you've got that capability, look for those, because you shouldn't be seeing that kind of exfiltration. And lastly, we've also seen Cobalt Strike being used. So that's got an internal capability for doing downloads and uploads, so they can just exfiltrate it out the way they came. So the final objective for the threat actor is the actual ransomware deployment. So this involves several things: encrypting the data, wiping the file so that you can't recover it, and then deploying a ransom note. In one case that we saw, so a lot of them tend to be custom malware, and they would encrypt. In one case, we saw a BitLocker being used. So you can see it's a complex chain, and there's a chart here, and it's not just an email and a ransom note. There are a lot of tools and techniques being leveraged. But one of the things, the big challenge is, where do you invest your detections? Because ideally, if you want to detect it earlier or prevent it, because if you try to detect it at the end, the ransom note or the ransomware, it's too late. You're not going to have a chance to respond from that. So trying to understand where we need to invest, what techniques do we see used quite a lot, and what are some of the quick wins. So understanding at the procedure level, we need to understand why the attacker is doing that, why are they using that command, why are they doing it that way, and when are they doing that as part of the attack lifecycle. So using the Mundian attack lifecycle, we can start to map the observed procedures that we see in the intrusions, and then start classifying them. And then from this, we can start to build an understanding of how frequent those procedures are, where they're being leveraged, what kind of telemetry data sources we can do, and start building up opportunities for detection. So it's evident from doing that analysis that most of the procedures are associated with maintaining persistence and internal recon stages. So the maintain persistence are creating a scheduled task, establishing that foothold across all the endpoints, and they spend a lot of time building that infrastructure. So, and they want to maintain that because that's their means of delivering that effect. The other one is internal recon, when they're moving around, discovering credentials, files of interest, and so on. They do a lot of discovery. The actual exploitation, document coming in, it could be quite difficult to detect. If it's a vulnerability that they're exploiting, you might not even know what you're looking for. You may be able to identify unusual things like certain processes being called and so on. But what we do know, it's not linear. It's not email, do this, do that, do that, and a ransom. There is a big recursive loop in the middle. And so like the internal stuff, like I say, they're continually reviewed all the time, and got the persistence as well. So they need to make sure that the beacons are in place. So the attack lifecycle, so this is based on a 19-day period. So the biggest challenge is detecting a malicious activity earlier on, and before it's too late. So you can see at the start of the intrusion, we can see a cluster of activity where they seem to do a lot of techniques. So they're trying to maintain access, doing a bit of internal recon on that endpoint, finding out what it's connected to, making some configuration changes, establishing the backdoors, access, and so on. And then it appears that there's a quiet period, and then they're doing more internal recon, discovering more endpoints. They remove laterally, and they'll keep repeating that. It's all building backdoors again on other endpoints. They will establish more foothold elsewhere on the network, carry on with more internal recon, so they'll bury deeper and deeper in the network. And then on the very last day, they will deliver that effect. So the question is, why do we see a lot of the internal recon again? So the main reason for that is when they deliver effect, they need to make sure that it has been delivered as the ransomware actually worked. So I've seen where they delivered a payload and it's not worked, they've made changes, and they've done checks, check and see if the files are actually encrypted. So that's a discovery technique. And it's also worth noting that for ransomware threat actors maintaining presence, so if they install like AnyDesk or Splashtop, you don't just get an indicator when it's been installed and process running. There will be a continuous network connection to Splashtop services, so that will be an indicator that there's a strong CTO activity. And then when we start to put all these procedures in the context of an intrusion, because we see in multiple cases of these, we start to see a pattern, and it's quite clear they're following a playbook. So the Conti leak confirmed the existence of very detailed playbooks and training material. So playbooks have several advantages. So they provide a baseline of common scripts and tools, and ensures consistent ways of working. So when they've got a team of operators within the group, they're all following the same ways of working when they do their intrusions. They've got their same toolkits. And it helps because not all of the operators are trained at the same level. So it helps that they're all sharing that knowledge, and they've got the right tools and configurations in place. So, for example, they have customized scripts for like AD finds and so on. So the procedures are battle tested. They work. It doesn't mean that they're sophisticated. It just means that the operator know when and where to use them. They know what commands to enter, and what to do, and what the objective on using that command. Some of the procedures are automated with custom scripts. So rather than having to type commands all the time, they will evolve their playbooks. They will put scripts in place to automate that discovery, the collection, and then the analyst, the operator can just take that and upload them. And the other bit, so we talked about new vulnerability, so it's a cat and mouse game for them as well. So as analysts, if we detect how they're doing it, and a security tool can detect what they're doing, they would have to up their game, they'll have to develop new procedures, leverage new tools, and if there's a new vulnerability coming out, or it's just being released, then they'll exploit that and incorporate it into their procedures. So whilst the playbooks are great, and they work, it provides an easy to follow procedure, operator can still make mistakes. So we've seen mistakes by operators. So they either tend to fall into console errors, where they've entered the wrong command, or they tooling issues where things break. So in one case, as part of the discovery, they were trying to do enumeration of installed antivirus products on the endpoint. And what the operator did, and that was done by a Cobalt Strike, they entered a very specific command on the host command shell, which was the AV query command, which is very specific to Cobalt Strike. It's a add-on script called Aggressor. So they entered it effectively in the wrong window. So in their Cobalt Strike console, they would have had like an interact with the beacon, and they would have had another window for non-interactive. So yeah, so that was at a bad day. But that kind of telemetry does get logged. So if you can capture that, that's pretty good. The other console errors is copy and paste. So it looks like they copied and pasted a command straight from a playbook. So where the IP should have been passed to task list, it should have been the actual IP address of the endpoint. So again, that would have thrown an error. So very useful detection opportunity. It doesn't happen all the time, but it can happen. And we have seen them several times. So the tools, AD Find, very popular tool of all the tools that we've seen. And the Conti Group, they actually automated that using adf.bat. And we've seen this being dropped on endpoints in a number of cases over the last 2 years. And they still use the same file name, adf.bat. And the same script is also favoured by other groups. So we can see from a country chat how they were saying that adf.bat was used by Ryuk, and then someone remarked it was actually created by them. So there you go. Tools are being leaked or shared amongst other groups, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So we've seen other scripts such as Advanced IP Scanner and PowerView as well. So all of them are in the public domain. FileZilla, Mimikat, so they all tend to get dropped. So look for files that are dropped in unusual files like temp folder, music folder, downloads folder. They're easy to spot. In terms of vulnerabilities, so we talked about the Exchange one. One I saw in a case where I was seeing Sam the admin as part of LDAP requests. Doing the analysis, yeah, it was linked to a publicly available script you could get from GitHub. So they'd obviously taken that, incorporated it into their procedure, and used it against this particular host. So it does demonstrate that groups, they are actively reviewing the vulnerabilities out there, working out which ones are definitely worth exploiting, and also looking for any code that's been released to exploit that. So they are relying on system administrators not doing their patching, hardening, and so on, and exploiting that as a weakness. And the US CERT, they produced a report as well, where they even acknowledged that after 2 weeks where a vulnerability is disclosed, and if there's a tool available, such as a proof of concept script, attackers will exploit. So that's a trend that they have seen, and it pretty much aligns to what we've seen as well in cases. We don't see huge amounts of customizations of scripts, so they tend to take what they've got and deploy it. It probably means that they're probably got operators, but probably a lack of developers in their teams, so they can't do a lot of tool development maybe, or whether they're just interested in using a tool just for a short amount of time before everything is patched, so they're probably not worth investing in building that vulnerability. So, yeah, again, a lot of scripts tend to fall into non-standard locations as well. So intrusions never always go to plan. So some of the more unusual ones are when things go wrong. So we've seen beacons be deployed, never call home properly, and it's just continuous DNS requests. And then they'll deploy another beacon on the same host, so they end up with multiple beacons on the same host, making continuous requests, and then one of them will connect. So they have issues as well with their infrastructure. So they might have developed a payload, they might have worked fine the day before, then all of a sudden their C2 infrastructure is being burned. So they have to create another one. So this is the problem with IOCs. It's quite easy to build a new domain, new IP, and so on. In another case, because there's a lot of ransomware groups, I actually saw two different operators on the same host at the same time, and they were following almost identical playbooks, how they were doing their enumeration, discovery, and moving. One took a different approach to doing lateral movement, whereas another one was successful in their lateral movement and did the encryption. Made it a bit more difficult for the analysts because they were very similar techniques they were following. So it just made it a bit harder to unpick, but it does happen. And some of the operators, they have a really good understanding of an environment that they've compromised. They probably know it better than the system administrators in some cases. So they'll know the security tools, the configuration, how things hang and network together. But they don't look out for the threat actors, so they're very focused on a defender, but not necessarily other threat groups. So the operators have been focused on initial access all the way up to ransomware. But I mentioned about TrickBot, so we mustn't forget about those. So don't just focus on ransomware techniques. Try to detect TrickBot and other types of access spooks, because if you can detect those, then it's unlikely the ransomware threat group can get into the network. Some of the smart activities we see are related to checks and blending. So we've seen safety checks. So this is fairly recent. So in one case, I saw the use of change code page, which I thought was quite unusual. Then doing a look on that, they're effectively looking for the language that is configured on the endpoint. So they're either trying to acknowledge, yes, that is a target they should be engaging, or based on the language, or if they're using a particular language they need to avoid. So that's my hypothesis on that. So they spend a lot of time doing those safety checks as well, and they also did a battle damage assessment as well. So I mentioned, like, it's not all about discovering stuff, but also confirming if the ransomware actually did work. So again, pretty clever, just confirming what they've done, actually delivered the payload. Pattern of life, exfiltration. In some cases, we've seen blending of activities where they've tried to exfiltrate data over several days with gaps and over hours. So again, fairly smart. So it's not a bulk data upload coming out, which will be very unusual. In terms of C2, I've mentioned that this is very hard for the operators to maintain post-compromise. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. So it's frequently served by Cobalt-like beacons, but there's also NEDES and other legitimate tools for long-term access. So typically you see a beacon on the edge serving HTTP, then internally there'll be SMB and they're linked together. And when things do go wrong, I've seen in cases where they pulled out-of-band payloads, effectively revealing a staging tooling server where they must store their tools and pull that down. Again, they use like curl, quite unique user agent string you not normally see. So ideally, they should be going for short and long-term haul beacons. It all depends how long the intrusion is going to be, but the key is for them to maintain access by any means possible. It's worth noting that a lot of the Cobalt Strike beacons are out of the box, so quite easy to spot in terms of default configurations. So going back to the data, so they're the four we work with. We work with a lot of different tools, a lot of them in the public domain. So as an analyst, you should be familiar with all of these tools or have some awareness of them. So that's what we're working with. So in terms of network analysis, looking at PCAP, it's not possible to just get a PCAP and then just throw it into Wireshark and just going through it individually. There's just too big data to work with. So converting it into like Zeek logs will help focus the triage a little bit better. And even running them against the emergent threats rules, snort rules, that could detect some of the low-hanging fruit as well, especially with default out-of-the-box configuration for beacons. And even just doing some basic analysis of the PCAPs, you can probably start to see trends where there's a lot of unusual post requests, a lot of traffic to particular host domains, user agent strings which are really odd, they don't fit in, and there's no other network traffic. So you can start looking for that. And the US, they provide malware analysis reports, and they share a lot of the common indicators as well, especially with Cobalt Strike. So memory analysis, this is quite a complex area. So if you get the right data and you're confident with it, you can use that to correlate with your log sources, especially if you've got telemetry around processes. And then you can start running YARA scans against that as well. And you can start to understand more of a deeper dive how that process is injecting into other processes. And if you've got the memory and you've got a Cobalt Strike beacon, you can use some of the open and the public domain scripts such as 1768.python, which is created by Digit Stevens, and you can extract the Cobalt Strike configuration. Again, you can use that to verify your indicators and the logs. So with all these data sources, try not to treat everything in isolation. Try to understand what your analyst workflow is and tie them all together. So if you've got gaps in one knowledge, use another data artifact to try to plug that gap. Try not to solve everything just from one data source. Log analysis, like I said, that's our main one. Usually we get lots of different types of log sources. We primarily work with Microsoft Windows, and we can work with PowerShell logs, security logs, sysmon logs. We can use things like Chainsaw, where we can load them with Sigma rules. Again, we can start to understand and classify the data. Again, with a lot of these tools, you need to understand the limitations. So for like YARA, for example, if you've got a rule, just understand the rule that you're trying to detect, because YARA can be used for detecting files as well as memory resident artifacts. So if you try to run a file-based YARA rule in memory, you might not get that detection if it's looking for like file size and header bytes and so on, which just doesn't exist in the memory properly. So yeah, so don't just throw everything at the tools. Still think, create hypotheses, understand what the attacker's done and where they think they are. Documents, again, tools around that. Array tools, again, you can quickly run through those and they'll come up with some indicators. So typical red flags or unusual API calls directly to Win32. Anti-debug scripts, where there's a lot of macros, where it's not human readable, where there's a lot of procedures calling procedures and things like that. Any unusual IOCs, calling files that are on the endpoint. So if you get enough of those flags, you can probably confirm my hypothesis, what you're seeing in the logs and then what you're seeing in the memory dump as well. And so another tool we work with is CyberChef by the NCSC. That is a brilliant tool. It is like a Swiss Army knife. We can take, there's got a number of functions in there for decoding, base 64 and so on. We can do artifact analysis, In some cases, they put swear words in there, and again, that can be an indicator itself. And we can start to put everything together, and even doing the binary, you can see like Conti reference in the binary files. So there's a lot of data we can work with. Testing, the key thing, okay, we understand how to detect it, we understand how the attacker works, the log file, the data that they work with. The important thing is to understand what actually works in your environment in terms of preventing it, detecting it, and how to respond. So the likes of checking your AVs, using Sigma. There's a lot of atomic tests out there that you can do, very simple test on the endpoint. So again, a lot of resources. So like Georgia, he generated an atomic case based on the change control page, and I wrote a Sigma rule for it. So again, that's your community working in action, really, to developing all these techniques and then being able to test them. There's a whole raft of resources, far too many to list here. NCSC provide a login made easy solution out of the box with a lot of default Windows log configuration, which is great. Manjin provide hardware Windows hardening guides, technique testing, and a US provide bulletins as well. So final advice. So Rob Joyce worked for NSA. He was head of chief of data access organisations. He did a brief several years ago. So one of the key takeaway comments from that was enable those logs, look at those logs. No point just collecting them and doing nothing with them. So his fear from a nation state hacker point of view was someone actually paying attention to the logs and the data and actually understanding what's happening on the environment, what user accounts are being used or abused and so on. So, yeah, quite often we see a lot of configuration where the logs are misconfigured. They haven't got the level of granularity, not the right time zone, and it just makes it really hard. And then you end up with gaps and you just don't understand what the truth is. So that's the key thing. Logs, collecting logs is really cheap. So, yeah, understand what you can collect, where you can store it, and how to exploit it. So, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. So keep an eye out on Twitter feed on our website. We publish blogs, tracking C2 servers quite frequently, so we try to produce 1 or 2 reports every month. A big final thanks to the DFIR Report team. So we spend a lot of time and effort in our own time analysing and reporting on techniques. It's a quite good team, and everyone's making use of the intelligence report out there, and a lot of the other threat intelligence reports have also matured over the last couple of years, following very similar approaches, moving away just from IOCs but indicated activities as well. And that is it. It's 3 o'clock on the day.